In this video I want to talk a bit about modelling for rigging and the kinds of topologies and whatnot we'll use. The topic of modelling itself can of course fill an entire tutorial or series of tutorials, and we aren't going to see much instruction on modelling in this series for that reason. However, the things that need to be understood from a rigging perspective are quite simple and thin and basic, so I want to take an overview of them now, so that you can work with them, apply some of the ideas and principles to your own modelling work when creating things to be rigged. Clearly, this is all about how things shape and deform as we pose them, and is therefore more about organic characters, things like machines and robots that have fixed solid parts you don't need to worry about so much. A couple of things I'll direct your attention to just before we start, which are worth checking out, is first of all this shoulder topology video on my YouTube channel. This is really exploring topology from the most basic shapes before we start getting into adding lots of subdivisions and so on. When you are trying to make good topologies and meshes for skinning, it can sometimes be advantageous to start out with just the most basic block forms. Make sure that those are working correctly and then start adding in the detail of extra subdivisions, so give that guy there a check out. Next is the ever reliable Hippodrome, which is the site of one of the character articulation artists at Pixar, and there's a good bit of detail here on articulation theory, modelling for articulation, bits about the body, bits about the face, the geometry, the edge loops, and so on. Do be aware that a lot of the models detailed on this site are intended for use in Maya, so there are some slight differences from how we would do things in Lightwave, mainly down to the density of the polygon mesh and the weighting, but an awful lot of the broad theory still applies. There are of course plenty of other resources around on the net to check out, so do have a hunt around for yourselves. Otherwise, here we are with a simple little box, and what I want to do with this is show the basic ideas for getting an articulated joint to work in Lightwave. Let's put a little division in here so we can say that this is something like, I don't know, an elbow or a knee. Now, as we've already mentioned, when you weight vertices to a bone for deformation, in a manner of speaking, it's not much different to parenting those vertices to a null or whatever rotator and then just turning them. What we are effectively doing is just grabbing vertices and rotating. And so that lets us demonstrate the basic ideas here in Modeler. And we can see that with just one division in our arm here, the kind of problems that we get. In this case, this would be the equivalent of having these four vertices 100% weighted to a bone. This area here is of course completely collapsing. That's no good. Of course, more generally what we would be doing is we would be rotating these some, so they would be getting, for instance, a partial weight or a partial deformation, and then the others would be rotating the rest of the way. But we see we're still getting a narrowing across that joint there. That's not what we're wanting. We're losing volume. The way that this is dealt with is by the adding of extra divisions or bands at these joints. So we always use higher density geometry around joint areas, thusly. And this allows us to sort of stagger our whole rotations a little bit via weighting and everything else as we go along. But we'll notice that even in this manner, what I'm starting to get is less than ideal. I'm getting a lot of bunching of these vertices here and the inside point of the elbow. Now this can perhaps be dealt with using corrective morphs to drag these things out in relation to the amount of rotation at the joint, and that certainly is one way of doing it. Another quite helpful way is to actually spread your lines at joints like this. So for instance, at the inside of the elbow we use a wider spacing of the points thusly and a narrower spacing at the back. The reason a design like this is good is because then when the joint begins to turn, we have more space on the inside for these guys to bunch up, so we don't get such a tight bunched, or in some cases collapsing geometry at the joint. And also we've started out with tighter points at the rear side, so when they space out, they don't space out quite as widely, helping us to maintain detail at the rear side there. Another way of stating this is to point out that when your character poses and deforms, effectively all you are doing is moving the points. Therefore, when you model your character and plan out your topology, it is important not just to look at where the points are in the modelled character, it's important to look at where they will go when the character deforms. So, elbows, knees, anywhere else where you're going to have some form of collapse as a joint deforms, it's good to have wide spacing in the collapsing area and tighter spacing in the opening area when you are at base pose, bind pose. This is straightforward enough, but of course this is just how we would deal with a 1D joint that's only pivoting on one axis. The places where people always have difficulty are of course the classics of shoulders and hips and the like. If you checked out that little shoulder video, then there's a start on shoulders, but let's take a look at some alternates as well. First of all, let's take a look at this little one, who essentially has the shoulder topology described in that video of mine. You can see the diamond of the shoulder, of course, exists here, subdivided through with additional geometry, and this can work quite well. Reasons why? Well, we have a vertex here, which is able to hold our shape of the shoulder mass like this when rotating. We have, just like the elbow example I just demonstrated, this widening of lines, this widening of edges and loops at the underarm point, which helps us to manage the collapse there when the arm comes down. We also, thanks to this little turn and pleat, or whatever you want to call it in here, have these extra lines over the top side, which can space out and hold shape when the arm comes down as well. We can see here how that all works out for us in terms of actual deformation on the joint itself, as well as of course what we get when coming inwards in this fashion here. If you prefer, there's the actual cage mesh itself in action. You can see how those points are working together there. Of course, an awful lot depends on the actual type of character that we are deforming. Here, in a cartoon style character, we can see that we're much lower poly and we have far less detailing around how this shoulder is modelled to join in. Our main geometric trick here is this triangle, which is again a handling of the underarm deform area. Since he is this very simple pipe cleanery sort of character, we don't need an awful lot around the actual shoulder itself to hold shape, or of course display any kind of muscle mass, deltoids and so on and so forth, and so you can get away with these very simple sort of lines. If we take a look at his hip down here, we can see again it's just got very simple lines. The legs just sort of pop off the end of the torso there with very little in the way of clever detailing. Being this simple cartoon character, this sort of geometry works out fine. If we go back to this girl and have a look at her hip, we see a structure that is very common and helpful when building hips. You'll see, of course, that the lines of our geometry form this V across the hip point. The problem deformation in hips is always when the leg comes straight up. The easiest way to deal with that is with this V that cuts out of the torso and into the thighs. And as you can see, on a line-by-line basis, it sort of staggers. So at this point on the belly, we're still more or less straight, and we slowly, in this line, start to drop down until we're getting into a quite pronounced V at this point, and then we start dropping it out again in these additional lines, coming back out towards flat again. This gives us, again, bunching here, wider spacing over here, which allows for the side-to-side leg motion, whilst keeping the shape and sort of mirroring what we saw demonstrated on that little box/elbow example. Of course, you might wish to use a few more divisions, even on cartoon-style characters, which this geometry here is from. As you can see, we're sticking with this V shape, but there's far less geo going on, but you do see that we've got these lines around the point of deformation, wider on the outside, tighter on the inside, and of course how they flow down back towards straight again. The shoulder here is incredibly simple. It literally just pops out from the upper torso there. There's no kind of clever diamond shape or anything else, and this, being a cartoon mesh, does work out reasonably well. You only need simple bends at these joints, and so simple geo of this fashion is usually good enough to get good deformation. You might, in the case of holding up the underarm, find it advantageous to again push this space here out a bit, but with simple characters, collapsing there is normally not so noticeable. Again here, reasonably simple cartoon girl. Look at the shoulder, nothing special to it, just simple straight lines coming off the flat edge of the torso here. This is the model that we saw holding the pencil back in the IK-FK video. Go back and take a look if you want to see how her shoulders are deforming in that. You'll notice that they work out perfectly reasonably well. As we start getting into more realistic characters, you do often start to need more geo to be able to hold the shapes of things, particularly the muscle shapes. You'll notice on this guy that we've again used this little cut-in, this pleat over the top of the shoulder to add extra geometry there so as it can space out. We've also got one extra line in the underarm area here. And you can notice how we're starting to use these other little cut-ins here on the forearm to start defining the shape of the musculature there. Yet still at the elbow here, you'll notice how we're keeping tighter lines on the back side with more spaced out lines on the inside. And the same at his knee down here, which is wider at the back and tighter at the front. We've also got this little cut-in at the front of the knee for the kneecap to help define that shape. One common piece of advice that you'll see given when modelling more realistic characters is to try and model your topology, have your edge flow go along with the musculature of the character. And certainly this is a fine piece of advice, but it is much more relevant to modelling than modelling for rigging. The main reason for this, of course, is that with a rigged and animated character, what is deforming is not actually the muscles themselves. The skin is not the shape of the muscles are beneath it and shaping the skin. What you need to model for is the skin shape. As such, you will find that you can take characters like this fella here, where we can see we've got a much more simple straight cutout from the shoulder rather than any kind of clever loops. And again, other than the bits of bulge that are added in, his entire arm is very much a tube cylinder type structure, very much cut square, lines going one way, lines going at 90 degrees to it. In many ways quite a simple geometry, and yet, done right, it will rig and deform pretty well, keeping the shaping of our character and shaping the skin as we want it, holding up those volumes as we would expect if there were indeed muscles operating below the skin. And we can just take a little look at him there with subdivision on to see that we are getting nice, smooth deforms out of this character topology there. It does work reasonably well. We do get an end result that is quite pleasing. There we go. Not perfect in this instance, and that does relate to the fact that it is a very simple topology. But as you can see, the results are still pretty decent, and many people would be happy with this in an awful lot of situations. We'll take a look at the Hulk mesh, which is a great example of both cut together. We see, of course, that his edge flow really is following much more the shape of the underlying musculature, so we do have a much more clever topology, as it were, going on here. But still, what is modelled is not so much the shape of the muscles as the shape of the skin that lies over the muscles. And as we've already seen in previous videos, he deforms really nicely when set up well. You can again notice here around the elbow how it's pretty clean, the geometry, just with details added in for the extra shaping. What you will often find works less well is geometry such as this, where you can see that we really have modelled out the muscle shape. Notice here how the muscles, the flexors in the forearm, are coming out to the upper arm position, which is of course where the muscles anchor. Similarly, the bicep muscle lines and edge topology is cutting right down into the forearm here. What you have is this overlap of topologies, which is of course true and correct for the musculature, but makes rigging it and getting clean deformation somewhat trickier. We also notice how incredibly dense the mesh is, especially in the underarm region here. The lines are very close to one another. In fact, this whole mesh is very polygon dense. It's not that lightweight a mesh at all. The result that this gives us, even though we can rig it, we have a much harder time getting good deformations out of it, as we'll see. Notice when I pull the shoulder up there, how we start to get this pinch. Now the shoulder normally won't come up this way naturally anyway, that's an overextension, but it's still pushing the edges of what's acceptable. And also notice as we come down here, we're getting this over pinch here in the underarm region that's very difficult to deal with. The main reason for that is the high density of geometry that we have. If we take a look at what happens at the elbow, we can see that, we can get it to bend and flex reasonably well, but because of these lines of the bicep that are extending into the forearm region, we get a little more fall off than we would like. Although we do still get a quite pleasing crease occurring here. And of course the extra geo at the backside for defining the elbow there doesn't hurt. This mesh really is pushing things a little too far in terms of both topology and density. This is an important point in Lightwave, mainly due to the way that our skinning tools work. Higher density meshes like this, or even denser still, are not much good for rigging. It's incredibly difficult to get good deformations out of them. In other packages like Maya, Max, you'll see people using very dense geometries. The different skinning systems in those packages lend themselves to that kind of meshing much more readily. Lightwave does not so much. You are much better with slightly lighter characters. As you can see from the Hulk example, you can still get very detailed geometry, but it is still reasonably light overall. And this sort of level of density and detail here is pretty much the upper limit that you want to go to with Lightwave. Something like this fella is starting to push it just a bit too much. Something that is often not so well known about working with characters of different polygon densities in Lightwave is the bone fall-off used. Very commonly when people have a character that's not deforming properly, they'll mess around with either adding geo or taking it away or fiddling with weight maps and so on. The first place to start every single time when you are trying to get your character to deform properly is to set an appropriate bone fall-off for the density of the mesh you are using. You go into the bones or joints that are deforming your character and you will have the fall-off type setting here. Bigger numbers, such as 128, give a tighter, shorter range fall-off, and lower numbers, such as 2 or nothing, give a wider range fall-off. For denser characters, use lower numbers or wider fall-off. For lower poly characters, use higher numbers or a tighter fall-off. For instance, on this fella here, I'm just going to bring his arm around in there on pitch, and if we take a close look, we can see that we're getting a bit of pinching in there at the shoulder, again down to the density, unfortunately. And we'll see that when we change this, let's take it straight up to 128, notice the pinching has become much worse, and when we take it way down, let's say to 2, we can see that the whole deform has become much smoother. Unfortunately, not very realistic for this fellow, as we're starting to thin out his bicep there. It's not a very realistic deformation. See, the whole thing just sort of starts to thin, and that's how the smoothness is maintained. But it does eliminate the pinching. Again, as I say, this character is just a little bit too high poly. The sweet spot for him is really around the 8 or 16, but again, owing to his topology and density, we are limited in what we can achieve with this mesh. When we do go beyond simple topologies, we'll find that there are some wonderful little structures that you can start to build that really help you out. This is a leg hip join. I know it doesn't look much like one at the minute. The main thing I want to show you here in having it so spread out is the actual kind of topology that we do have going on. You can see that what we have here are these lines that run next to one another. With the legs spread out completely like this in a split, all of these lines line up nicely, helping us to maintain the overall shape there. You'll notice around here, this is where the buttocks would be, we have these lines flowing up and into the back, off the leg. Again, helps us to maintain the shape in this pose. A very extreme pose to be sure, but you can see how the topology does hold it up quite well. If we look at how this thing would appear with legs down, and here it is, the exact same topology in the exact same mesh, we can see some of the things that we've seen already. We get this V shape starting to cut in here, which of course flows out into the leg, and those lines that come off the back of the leg and up to the buttocks become nice and straight. This topology is clearly a bit more complicated. You can see all of these little diamonds that are cut in for giving us extra lines here and there, these little cut-ins that work around here. But a topology like this does give you an awful lot of posing freedom, and it does mean that as these legs roll around all over the place, you will be able to hold and maintain shape quite well. Notice as well on this that these lines running down the leg don't run straight down. They twist around and come off to the side like this. This helps in the twist action of the leg. You'll notice that when we are out here in spread eagle, the actual kneecap is not at the front. It's actually running in line with with what would be the side of the body here. A very interesting topology and a very useful one for an area like this, on a character that again is probably going to be more realistic when it's fully modelled out. Of course, another important area of topology are faces, let's not forget. In Lightwave, the most common way of deforming faces is going to be with morphs, but irrespective, even if you were going to use bones somehow, you would want to pay attention to things such as loops. Basically, give yourself geometry to be able to shift and move, or edges of things and loops of edges to be able to move in such a fashion that they will hold the different shapes that the face needs to get into. So loops around the mouth as such, loops around the eyes, these edges that run down into the face here, and of course that run up across and over the cheek. These are all important. One to always watch for is the fold of skin known as the nasolabial fold, which we get crunching up when we smile, or of course in some folks that is there even in a neutral pose. It is quite common to see folks put this loop in the wrong place. They put it coming from down here at the mid-nose point. Have a look for yourself, you'll see that it actually comes off the top of the nose wing. So keeping this loop in the right place on the face is also very important to make sure that you get believable deformation in a character face. What things such as those wildly spread legs also start to introduce us to is the idea of base pose or bind pose. When you model your character, you model it of course in a specific pose, and it is in this pose that you will add your bones, deformers, controllers and so on for setting up your rig. This is your bind pose, where the character is actually bound to the deformation controls. And bind pose can play an important role in how your character winds up deforming. You might have noticed going through the different characters there, we had a different array of bind poses that they were modelled in. There is of course this one, the classic T pose where everything is out completely straight and fixed. Notice that the arms are completely on the level here. If I pick our three controllers there for the wrist, elbow and shoulder, you can see that they are on a perfectly flat line. The same again on the leg here, and you'll notice that the feet are pointing dead front. This is a good pose for the process of rigging itself, that is setting up all of the controllers, because everything's on these nice flat lines that are aligned with the axis of the world. Makes it very easy when you're making sure that your rotations line up or that your control systems are on a plane. But it's not always the best for deformation later on, as things are in this very rigid sort of pose, which is quite unnatural really. Just try and stand in it yourself, so completely rigid and flat. Everything is of course pushed out to maximum, so the elbow is at full extension here. This means that when you want to turn it in and flex the elbow, you have to deal with a complete set of deformation on the inside and of course the outside vertices. Therefore, a common way of setting up base pose is to model your character with some pre-bend already in it. This means that when you deform it in posing, it doesn't have to deform quite as much. Or rather, it is still deforming as much, but it's going off in two different directions. So you've got one deformation running this way, and then another deformation running that way. That can be easier to handle. As such, common alternate poses that you'll see for a bind pose, especially for more realistic characters, as I say, with cartoon characters they're much softer, so it's often less important, but still, you will find that there is the A-frame pose with the arms partially down. This of course helps an awful lot for shoulders. This squat or pre-bend pose, where of course things are already pre-bent ever so slightly, or pre-twisted as we see with the feet there. You can have your shoulders already coming slightly forwards to help ease deformation on the inside of the shoulder part there. Even sometimes some much more extreme pre-bending of whole parts of the character, not just the limbs but the back and everything, sometimes referred to as the invisible motorcycle. And of course, in relation to twists, there's also areas that are worth paying attention to, such as the hand and forearm. This pose, known as the palms down, where the action of the palm or the line of the palm is set at 90 degrees to the action of the elbow. In this pose, the forearm is actually twisted. This is its pronated pose. The alternate is, of course, the palms forward pose. In this case, the arm is untwisted, and it can sometimes be helpful to model something in its untwisted rather than its twisted state, mainly because it can sometimes be easier, again depending on the specifics of topology and density, to make something deform into its twisted state rather than to deform into its untwisted state. So there we go. Those are the basics of modelling for rigging in terms of topology, pose, density, and so on.